Welcome back to the Truth Factory. It seems like several YouTubers are getting deleted and demonetized just for saying anything on this topic, unless through the mainstream media. And also in Canada, they're potentially making it illegal to talk about this topic in any way that goes against the official narrative. So I'm just going to double down on that narrative in hopes that I don't go to jail. Everyone is acting like there's some big conspiracy theory about the coronavirus, when really, it's just a bunch of totally strange coincidences. Because it's not like the Chinese government, which has a totally perfect track record for being completely transparent, would ever stifle or prevent the release of any relevant or critical information that could have prevented this entire pandemic that completely crashed the global economy. Of course, it's not suspicious at all that before the outbreak there were multiple research papers published on exactly how bats can transmit the potentially deadly coronavirus to humans. And there was even a paper published that discusses the creation of a new synthetic self-replicating chimeric virus that's incurable and able to cross species, created using a coronavirus found in Chinese horseshoe bats that created human-like severe acute respiratory syndrome in mice. But it's just a pure coincidence that the same scientist named Shizing Li who conducted these bat experiments worked in a level 4 bioweapons lab in Wuhan, China, the origin of the outbreak. A lab that homes samples of these very bats that contain the virus that causes COVID-19. It's also totally not weird that in November of 2019, just a month before the first known corona outbreak, that this very Wuhan lab posted this job ad seeking scientists to research the relationship between the coronavirus and bats, with a follow-up posting just a month later, about 2 weeks after the first supposed outbreak, with this posting looking for even more scientists to help with a new discovery of a terrible virus and its potential to be transmissible to humans. I think it's fair to say that we can just ignore all of this information. Even though it would be fairly easy for someone to accidentally get infected through either improper handling or disposal at this lab, infecting someone with this virus, which can have a 14-day asymptomatic incubation period, in which it could be easily spread from person to person without even being aware that they had been infected in the first place. It's also just a coincidence that several whistleblowers came forward to say that Shizing Li's lab was haphazardly mismanaged, and that this is where the virus came from, including Zhao Botao, who published a report that revealed that researchers on multiple occasions in that lab had been splashed with urine and blood samples from the bats that were collected, and that they had to quarantine themselves for 14 days. Shizing Li wrote on social media that those spreading rumors about her lab leaking the virus should shut their foul mouths. Which is not at all worrisome. I mean, I wouldn't want anyone to actually alert the public of the risks and implications involved if an unpredictable and deadly synthetic virus with no cure were to somehow escape into the biosphere. It's also not weird that another researcher working in the same lab named Huang Yanglin's picture, resume, and thesis have mysteriously gone missing from the Wuhan Institute website, especially since it's been rumored that she might have actually been infected with the virus at the lab. It's also not weird that when a reporter asked about Huang Yanling, that the Wuhan Institute originally denied that she had ever existed. But since her being a part of the Institute is published public knowledge, the Institute later remembered that she did, in fact, exist, that she's alive and well, and somewhere totally unaccounted for, and that her complete disappearance is only a vicious rumor, and that they'll take legal action if anyone asks any more questions. So we can safely say that that theory is totally Snopes debunked. There is nothing more to see here, since we know that the virus officially started at the Wuhan seafood market, because people were eating bats. Of course, we need to ignore this paper citing that over a third of the original patients, including patient 0, had no connection whatsoever with the market, and that while you may think that COVID-19 leaking from a virology lab where they were studying samples of bats that contain COVID-19 sounds very possible, get that out of your head and listen to the Chinese government and the communist news network's official narrative that the disease originated at the Wuhan wet market, a market that doesn't even sell bats and where there were no bats found. I mean, you can buy and eat peacocks, koalas, giant salamanders, civets, and rats there if that tickles your fancy, but no bats. So if this story is true, in order for the Wuhan seafood market, which doesn't sell bats, to be the place of origin of this bat virus, it means that bats flew over 1,800 kilometers from their natural habitat in the caves of Yunnan province, a straight line equivalent to the distance from New York to Colorado, to a highly populated and polluted seafood market which just happened to be less than 4 kilometers away from China's only level 4 bioweapons lab that just happened to be studying samples of coronavirus from these very bats. The same bats, now sightseeing in Wuhan, must have simultaneously infected people who were not at the seafood market at this time, including scientists who worked at that virology lab that were just, again, coincidentally, studying those very bats with that very virus. It really makes you think. In fact, the probability of all of these coincidences coinciding is virtually zero. But if that's the official narrative, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. Of course, for everyone's personal safety, the Wuhan wet market was immediately shut down and cleaned without any further investigation, as if they were destroying evidence of a crime scene. And by January 1st, the very same infectious disease research lab in Wuhan tested samples from the seafood market that showed some traces of the novel coronavirus, making the Wuhan wet market the scapegoat. I mean the only true and real narrative for this entire thing. Then a WHO-appointed expert panel arrived in Wuhan immediately after the first patients tested positive and established a set of diagnostic criteria that stipulated that patients needed to have a history of contact with the Huanan seafood market in order to get a novel coronavirus diagnosis. Why did the panel do this knowing that at least a third of the original cases testing positive had no connection at all to the seafood market? Well, I don't know, but I'm sure it wasn't influenced at all by a group that China formed to combat this virus that was full of Chinese propaganda officials, including the vice chairman of the group who is the Communist Party's propaganda czar. Like, obviously, if you're trying to stop the spread of a deadly virus, you wouldn't put more virology experts and doctors on the panel. No, it's far more helpful to have propagandists there, so that way they can tell everyone what to think. Wait a minute. But it's not like China's government was trying to silence an entire scientific community, including Dr. Li Wenliang, who broke news of the virus in late December, but was severely reprimanded by Wuhan's authorities for rumor mongering. And then he died a short time afterwards from the very same virus, but don't ask questions about this totally weird coincidence. It's also just a coincidence that after all of this, the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology released a new directive titled Instructions on Strengthening Biosecurity Management in Microbiology Labs that handled advanced viruses like the novel coronavirus. It's an even bigger coincidence since the Wuhan lab is the only microbiology lab in all of China that studies advanced viruses. But it's not like the World Health Organization or WHO would help cover up a deadly disease. The same WHO that is headed by a literal communist named Dr. Ghebreyesus that has a controversial past of covering up at least 3 epidemics of cholera in Ethiopia. It's not like the president of China's wife is a World Health Organization goodwill ambassador who works with Dr. Ghebreyesus. I'm sure that is not a conflict of interest in any way. And it's not like the WHO completely ignored this email from the government of Taiwan asking if they should be concerned about these new mysterious pneumonia cases. It's only a mere coincidence that it seems like the WHO was covering up this virus to the point where it looks like they may have actually wanted a global pandemic. Like when they said a month after the outbreak that there was no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus, and that closing off borders would not be effective, even though countries who did close off their borders early on had noticeably smaller amounts of cases of this virus. Of course, talking about this or associating the virus in any way with China is completely racist, even though China is not a race, it's a country and the origin of the virus. We also have to forget about Zika, Ebola, German measles, Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, guinea worm, MERS, norovirus, Japanese encephalitis, and West Nile, that were all named after their places of origin. Of course, what is important here, though, is being politically correct, not actually caring about the lives of billions of people and the global economic collapse. So take that, xenophobes. But it's totally not racist that China's businesses are now refusing to serve black people due to COVID-19 fears, and that all black people are being forced into mandatory testing and quarantine by the Chinese government. And while that sounds extremely racist, it isn't. We can also just totally trust the virus and death numbers coming out of China, because again, it's not like China has ever lied about anything before or would ever put its own people in any danger. I'm sure the stacks of thousands of urns outside of funeral homes and the fact that employees at the crematoriums were working 19-hour days in February is totally not related to any sort of suspicious government cover-up. And whatever they're spraying people down with here is totally also fine to breathe in. Anyway, there is clearly no weird conspiracies going on here. And if this video is not removed and I don't go to Canadian jail, I'll make a part 2 because there's a lot more to this entire story that needs to be covered instead of covered up. As always, thank you for your support. Links in the description. Have a great night. Meow.